The history of choral music. Starting with the medieval period, during this time, this was before traditional notation was invented, so music looked like what we see in the bottom photo. Gregorian chants were sung in churches and chapels all over Western Europe, and these were monophonic single line melodies, so they had no accompaniment or voice parts, everyone just sang in unison. And these were most often written in Latin. Then came the Renaissance period. During this time, motets were popular. They were also religious and based on Latin text. They often lacked a clear beat or rhythm, but they did feature multiple voice parts, often singing overlapping, cascading chords. Madrigals were also popular during this time. They were mainly non-religious, and they were dance-like, carefree songs about eating or drinking. Motets and madrigals were both mostly sung a cappella. Troubadours and trouvères were poet-musicians that would travel on foot around France, and they would sing songs like madrigals about love, betrayal, and politics. Then came the Baroque period. This was between 1600 and 1750. There was increased interaction between vocalists and instrumentalists. Music was used to excite emotions and was often very dramatic. Oratorios were concert-length compositions of instruments and voice parts, so often orchestras and choirs, that taught biblical tales or moral stories. An example of an iconic oratorio would be Messiah by George Frederick Handel. One of the greatest composers of all time came from the Baroque period, and this was Bach. He was known for his complex pieces that featured independent melodies, so he used counterpoint like we saw in the Renaissance period. Another famous composer would be Monteverdi. He was the first to compose for instruments, and he bridged the gap between the Baroque and classical periods, which we'll see on the next slide. So next came the classical period. This was between 1750 to 1820. Music during this time had a lighter, clearer texture and a rhythmic energy. Music was objective and formal, so it was music for the sake of making music, not really to tell a story or represent anything in particular. Symphonies were developed during this time, and notable composers were Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. Then came the Romantic era between 1800 and 1915. This was led by Beethoven, who transitioned from the classical period into the Romantic period. So music was subjective and pushed the boundaries of the classical era, so it was often used to tell a story, and was very expressive. Composers utilized chromatic harmony rather than independent melodies like we saw in the past eras. Music is often sung with a rich and full sound versus the light and clear sound of the classical period. Notable composers were Brahms, Schubert, Schumann, Mendelssohn, and of course Beethoven. Lastly, the modern/postmodern era. During this time, there were many different categories of music. Some include Impressionism, a famous composer would be Debussy, and Minimalism, famous composer would be Philip Glass. Richard Wagner had a large influence on this era. He was one of the first to popularize dissonance and atonality, which are unlikely chords and harmonies. And many composers after that use this concept in their compositions as well. And music during this time often reflects and responds to what is going on in the world.